Hello everyone, my name is Swanee and thanks for stopping by and checking out my channel. Now for today's video, I'm going to be going over all of the brand new weapons that just released in the new Viper Commandos Premium Warbond. Now this Warbond is a bit different than all of the previous Warbonds because in this one they decided to add more cosmetics and less overall weapons. So I'm only going to be going over 3 weapons in total: the AR-23 Liberator Carbine, the SG-22 Bushwacker Secondary Shotgun, the K2 Throwing Knife, and then I'm also going to be going over the new armor passive, which is the Peak Physique armor passive, and then they also added a new booster, which is the experimental Infusion booster. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first up, it's the AR-23 Liberator Carbine. Its description says it's a compact version of the Liberator designed for increased viability in close quarters. It has an increased fire rate at the cost of higher spread. And then if we take a look at the stats, it has 60 damage, it has a capacity of 45, the recoil is 26, and the fire rate is 920. And unfortunately for its weapon traits, it only has light armor penetrating. It comes with a flashlight and it has 3 rate of fire options, which are full auto, semi-auto, and burst fire. And unfortunately, it only has 1 scope variation, so you can't change the zoom on your scope. What you see is what you get. And it can hold up to 7 magazines, which gives you a total of 315 rounds. Alright, so now that the stats are out of the way, I'm kind of on the fence about this weapon. Now, I do think it's fun, I did enjoy using it, and it's great against smaller enemy types. Like, it's an absolute blast when I was going up against, like, the smaller bugs or those small, like, individual robots. But it definitely struggles when you're facing up against any of the medium tier enemies since it only has light armor penetrating. And I found myself constantly burning through my ammo since it has such a high rate of fire, and this honestly felt more like an SMG than it did an assault rifle. And I wouldn't say that this is a bad weapon, it's just I don't see much of a reason to choose this over some of the other assault rifles that hit way harder. If you decide to use this weapon, you're going to have to bring some sort of stratagem that can take care of those medium tier enemies like the heavy machine gun or a rail cannon or a quasar cannon, just, something that can take out those bigger enemies. And when you compare it to the other assault rifles, they can easily take out those medium tier enemies without the help of a stratagem slot. So definitely keep that in mind if you're going to consider getting this weapon. I'd say overall, I'd give this assault rifle like a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I thought it was fun, and I'd probably bring it with me on lower difficulties, like maybe difficulty 5 or difficulty 6. But when I was playing and testing it out on Helldive, I definitely felt like I was at a pretty big disadvantage. So I'd say that this weapon was definitely pretty fun to use, it just didn't blow me away. Alright, so moving on to the SG-22 Bushwacker Secondary Shotgun. This is the first secondary shotgun to come to Helldivers 2, and its description says that it's a triple-barreled break-action sawed-off shotgun, and you can switch the firing modes to fire all 3 barrels at once. And from my testing, I ended up really liking this shotgun. I found success against both the automatons and the terminids, and I kept it in the default firing mode when I was facing the smaller enemies. Anytime something was rushing me and got up in my face, I would keep it on the default firing mode. And then if something big came up, I'd switch the firing mode to shoot all 3 shots at one time, and it would do a ton of damage. And if you shoot all 3 shots at once, it can one-shot kill spewers if you shoot them in the face. And it was also doing surprisingly well against the Devastators too. I'd say that this is a great secondary for when you find yourself getting rushed by either spewers or brood commanders or devastators. And maybe for your primary, you're either out of ammo or you chose an SMG and whatever your primary is just doesn't hit hard enough to take out those medium tier enemies. The SG-22 Bushwacker is a great secondary for those scenarios. Do be careful though, if you like to shoot all 3 barrels at once, you are going to burn through your ammo reserves pretty quickly. And another cool thing about this shotgun is that you have to reload it 1 shell at a time, so you can cancel the reload animation and fire off a quick shot if you're getting rushed. So I found myself just spamming the reload button, it would reload a shell, I'd fire the shell, reload a shell, fire the shell, and you could just rapid fire shots off like that. So this secondary shotgun surprisingly has a pretty quick rate of fire if you cancel the reload animation. And I'd say overall, I don't have any complaints with the SG-22 Bushwacker, and I'd give it my seal of approval. There are a lot of good secondary options now in Helldivers 2, and I'd probably put this in the top 3 for sure. And this is probably going to be in most of my loadouts going forward. If I'm not using the secondary grenade pistol, I'm probably going to be using this shotgun. And then next up is the K2 Throwing Knife. Now this is the final weapon that you can unlock on the bottom page of the new Warbond, although honestly I would probably just spend your medals on something else, because I was really disappointed with this throwing knife. But let's go over the description. It says it delivers silent justice to freedom's enemies, and it has no stats or special traits. And this was by far the biggest disappointment of this Warbond for me. I just was not happy with this throwing knife. So this takes up your grenade slot. You have no grenades, and you only get 8 throwing knives. And unfortunately, you cannot pick them up off of the ground once you throw them, and you can't collect them from dead enemies. So you end up burning through your knives very quickly. And the damage is absolutely awful. I figured since you were giving up a grenade slot, the knife would at least pack a pretty strong punch, and sadly, that's just not the case. It also isn't stealthy like the description suggests. I tried to sneak around with the scout armor that makes it harder for enemies to detect you, and I was trying to take out like entire bases without getting caught, but I very quickly found out that that was close to impossible. Anytime I threw a knife at something, it would either 1, miss because it doesn't line up with your reticle, so I would constantly be throwing and the knives would just go to the left. Even though I'd be throwing at a target that was completely still and they weren't moving, I would still end up missing with the knife because it just doesn't line up with the reticle. I don't know what's going on with it, but it's super inaccurate. I tried it with controller, I tried it with mouse and keyboard, so there's something off with the accuracy of the throwing knives. And then secondly, anytime I'd try to be stealthy and use my throwing knives, I'd just alert everything nearby anyway. I tried everything I could think of. I even tried throwing the knives off into the distance to try to distract the robots, but as soon as I'd throw it, they'd immediately know where I was. The only semi-success I had was against the small, weak enemies. It can one-shot kill like the smaller robots and the smaller bugs, but any medium enemies like the Devastators or above were just impossible to kill. There were multiple times where I threw all 8 of my knives into one Devastator, and it didn't seem to do anything. And that, to me, is not worth a grenade slot. It's like I could choose an impact grenade and kill the Devastator in 1 or 2 grenades, or I could throw all 8 of my knives into the Devastator and it will still survive. And honestly, I don't know what the devs were thinking with this one. You give up a grenade for 8 weak, inaccurate throwing knives that don't even keep you in stealth when you use them. So I just don't see any upsides to choosing these knives at all. Even if you could pick up the knives off of the ground to replenish your ammo, I still wouldn't recommend choosing them because they're just so underpowered. So sadly, I was not impressed with the throwing knives at all, and I feel like they'd have to get a pretty significant buff before I'd recommend them. Alright, so moving on to the new armor perk. It's the Peak Physique armor passive. It increases melee damage by 50% and improves weapon handling with less drag on weapon movement. So I tested out the light, medium, and heavy armor versions of this perk. If you didn't know, there's actually medium armor with this perk in the Superstore right now, and I was kind of disappointed with this perk, to be honest. Now, when I first heard that we were getting this perk, I imagined that you could make an entire melee-focused build around it, and that's sadly not the case. Since you can't melee with the throwing knives and there are no melee weapons currently in the game, your only option is to hit things with your weapon. And melee has always been a last resort kind of thing. Melee damage has never really been too strong, and the 50% extra damage from this armor perk doesn't really make that much of a difference. I tried a couple different melee builds, and I tried to use the personal shield to make me a little bit tankier, but I didn't have much luck. I sort of had some success running around punching the little bugs, and that was kind of it. So if you're facing the Terminids and some hunters are like hitting you from behind, this perk is okay with dealing with some of those guys, but that's kind of it. You definitely can't run up to enemies and expect to punch them to death. It's just not a good strategy. That 50% extra damage just isn't really that noticeable. And unfortunately, I don't see this perk being that useful unless they add some melee weapons maybe later on down the road. And then for the improved weapon handling with less drag on the weapon movement, I couldn't really tell much of a difference with this either, to be honest. I tried testing out different weapons. I tried different armor sets in comparison. I tried shooting the weapons to see if the recoil was affected. I tried swaying the weapon around back and forth to see if it was like faster or slower, and it felt exactly the same to me no matter what armor set I was using, so I couldn't tell much of a noticeable difference with that part of the perk either. So the melee damage doesn't really make that much of a difference, and the less weapon drag I couldn't tell much of a difference either. So the perks are a little underwhelming, but at least the armor looks cool. I mean, it's a 10 out of 10 on the looks. I think it's some of the coolest looking armor that the game has to offer, but yeah, I just wasn't impressed with those new perks. And then lastly, I want to talk about the new experimental Infusion booster. Now, its description says, in addition to restoring health, stems temporarily increase movement speed and damage reduction, and it causes trembling. Now, as for the causes trembling, all that does is basically just turns your screen yellow, and that's basically it. So the trembling isn't really that big of a deal. But as for the stems temporarily increasing your movement speed and giving you damage reduction, this is one of the best boosters in the game now. I was kicking so much ass with this booster. I put on the light medic armor set, so I could already run super fast because it was light armor, and the medic armor gives you 2 additional stems. So anytime I popped a stem, I had 2 extra seconds of stem time because of the medic armor, I had increased movement speed, and I had damage reduction. And this basically turned my light armor into heavy armor. I was taking so many hits and it just didn't matter. And I was able to speedrun a number of different missions. I played like 3 or 4 different missions where I had to just run around the map and blow up fabricators, and I did it in no time. Anytime I took a little bit of damage, I'd pop a stem and then I'd run away and the enemies couldn't keep up with me. It was great. So like, this is one of the best boosters by far. I would make sure somebody in your fire team brings this with you pretty much every single match. This is definitely going to be one of those boosters that becomes a part of everyone's loadout. So overall, with this Warbond, I'm pretty disappointed with it. I love the update. Like, I love all the changes and stuff that came with this update. But for this Warbond, I think it's underwhelming. I like the previous Warbonds where we got more weapons. That was just more fun to me. And especially when the weapons aren't that good. Like, the throwing knife was a huge disappointment for me in this Warbond. So that only gives me an okay assault rifle and a pretty decent secondary shotgun. So if you're on the fence about this Warbond, it's hard for me to recommend it personally, but if you want your mech and your ship to have camo and you want it to look cool, I mean, hey, maybe that's worth it to you. But if you're on the fence and maybe you don't play this game all the time, I would consider getting some of the other previous Warbonds first, because the weapons definitely didn't blow me away, and I wouldn't buy this entire Warbond just to get these weapons. But that does it for my thoughts on all the new weapons that were added in the Viper Commandos Warbond. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section down below. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications. That way you don't miss out on any future Helldivers 2 videos. And if you made it this far in the video, consider giving me a thumbs up because it helps me out in the algorithm. It helps push this video to new viewers. And that is going to do it for me, guys, and I will talk to you all in the next video.